let me welcome the panel, please, onto the stage. Let me welcome Bruno Bioni, who is the founder of Data Privacy Brazil, Alison Gilwald, the Executive Director of Research ICT Africa, Peter Major, the Vice Chair of the UN Commission on Science and Technology for Development, and Mr. Abdul Raham Habib, the Vice President of the Strategy Management Office at the Saudi Data and Artificial Intelligence Authority. Thank you to all of you. Now, you heard that our colleagues here in the room, and I expect probably those watching online, need some reassurance from us. They need to know that we, at least on this stage, have some ideas for how to make this better. So let me start by asking all of you, what do you think is the single most pressing governance challenge that we face in governing data in ways that will unlock the value for AI and for other applications, but do that in a way that reassures people that it's being done well, that protects human rights, that embodies the values that we want to see in the systems that we are developing. Bruno, let me start with you.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you so much for the invitation. I think at the macro level, we are lacking a more technical, social, dynamic approach, so it's avoiding us to shift from an individual perspective to a more collective perspective. And at the micro level, I think the lacking of data quality, because it's furthering not only discrimination, but also makes even more vulnerable groups invisible to the data sets and also the optimization process. And the nexus between those two elements at the macro and micro level, the lacking of data, metadata and paradata to measure accountability in those flows. So those are the three main pressuring issues that I would like to pose.
Thank you very much. Alison, what would your answer be to that?
Thank you, Claire. I think the biggest challenge is actually ensuring that people experience benefits from these technologies being applied. And I think a major challenge to that is that the majority of the world, certainly the majority of Africans, have no knowledge or experience or awareness of how it is being used or not being used, or how they might benefit from it. So I think we've got some really foundational challenges around inclusion, digital equality and inclusion, and data justice, around the digitization of people's lives in Africa, in the global south more generally, so that it is reflected in these data sets, that people can see the benefits associated with this. And then I think the real challenges around the existing status quo and the inequities that are around, associated with it, are the inabilities to enforce any regulations that we know need to be taken in place. So, just to address the issue of, oil as data as oil, I think it's really important that it's understood that, that data isn't a finite resource. The data is a public good, and it needs to be regulated as such. And that is actually its value, that is its strategic value, is that it's non-rivalrous, that it can be used again, and that we need to regulate it so that people are able to do that in a more equitable way, and so that the benefits are there for all.
Thank you. Peter, as the chair of the UN's Working Group on Data Governance, this is officially your job. So tell us the first thing you think that we should be doing.
Well, I think we have to speak the common language. When we talk about data and data governance, probably each and every one of us are thinking something different. So to me, one of the most important things that we should come to a common understanding what we are talking about. And that would be the first step towards regulation, towards governance, towards a better understanding what we are doing. And we have to be clear about it. Data was always important. I just recall the time when I was a physicist, particle physicist, and we have been dealing with data. And it was absolutely interesting. But data has come into every sphere, every sector of the economy. So it's really important aspects came into being. So to me, it's really important to have a common understanding. And since we are in the very beginning of a long journey, I believe that we have to put down the fundamentals in this aspect. And we have to be, if you let me continue, we have to be extremely careful not to build new divides. And these divides, which has been already mentioned, it may be an age divide, it may be an educational divide, it may be a geographical divide, and so on. You know what I'm talking about. So we have to be extremely careful about it.
You, please.
I'll take an optimistic view in this. I believe data regulation and the data governance is quite there for quite some time in multiple fields. But what's happening with AI, it's taking us to another level. And we are talking now data in use with AI, not data by itself. Therefore, what's important is, yes, regulation, but what's more important is the capacity building for people to understand, as maybe Peter mentioned, to understand what are we talking about and how can that reflect in the data management and the data governance practices. Many governments already have done a good job into data governance for quite some time now, for years. What's remaining now is to update that into the AI world today. And going back to your point with the comparison with the oil, now you cannot use oil while it's in the transfer. You cannot use oil in different situations, but you can actually use data while it's in the transfer. You can analyze it on the fly. You can also analyze multiple data points, while that does not happen with oil. Therefore, even the regulation and the talk about all this need to be informed, and people need to understand how that happens and how this type of regulation could happen. Then also, what's the impact? I think many of us think about the impact on our privacy and our security and so on. But what data is used, and what is it used for, and in what form, and can it be traced and back to you, and is it happening even by big companies or others?
Thank you. No, and I agree with you about the limitations of the analogy. I always feel somewhat conflicted using it because it's so useful to make the point. And yes, as you say, I think some of the challenges that we have with data governance are also rooted in our reliance on analogies that think about trade in products and not about, as you say, the sort of intangibles that we see with data. So I think it's useful, but it only takes you so far. So as we start the discussion about data governance within the new working group and think about the international dimension, as we do, of course, here in the United Nations, of course, we're not starting from scratch. We're building on a number of existing national, sometimes even subnational innovations in data governance. So I'd like to perhaps start with you, Bruno, to just talk a little bit. There have been many interesting experiments with data governance in Brazil, of course, and across Latin America. So I wonder, how do you think that global frameworks like the one that we are talking about today can be most useful in supporting national regimes and the efforts of governments and communities inside countries in trying to make sure that the data is doing good, to come back to the original question?
Thank you, Claire. So as Peter highlighted before, in I think Latin America, but also Global South, has a lot of to be shared. What would be like the common language for people to take agency over data? And there in Latin America and also in the Global South, there are numerous examples of what being called a data generation citizenship. What it means that the population, the community, could generate data in order to defend the territory, for instance, indigenous people, or a fisher community to monitor how sustainable is or not the environmental in that issue, or such as in Brazil, in favelas, to the poor people, demand the government to make the infrastructure more resilient or not in order to address climate change. So that's talk about and is connected with the previous comments that I did. That's a good example how from the micro level we could see a social technical approach in terms of governance. The people is the pillar of the governance. The community is the pillar of the governance. And also from the micro level, it's marvelous in terms of data quality, because people is refining the data sets from the ground. So that kind of examples, and the Global South here, I think, is leading those kind of inspiring initiatives, should be triggered and should be accelerated, of course, by public investment, but as Amandepi showed us, by having public infrastructures, digital public infrastructures, and mainly capacity building of escalating those initiatives from data literacy, mainly, I would say.
Thank you. And Abdulrahman, you lead the Saudi Data and Artificial Intelligence Authority. So you're also living this reality of national systems and here thinking about global systems. How do you see the articulation between the two in the Saudi context?
I'll build on Bruno, I think, comments. Today, capacity building is one of the core that government, especially the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, is working on. For the past couple of years, we trained more than 1.5 million trainees in data and AI in the past couple of years. And the number is just growing. And we are taking that even to the global level through the International Center for AI with the UNESCO to train 25,000 women in the next couple of years in AI. We already did batch 1, and we are hopefully announcing batch 2, and many other programs within the kingdom in capacity building in specific, because as I think Peter mentioned earlier, we need to have the common language. We need to know what we are talking about. Regulations are happening. We have the personal data protection law and multiple other policies in place in the kingdom, but also we're playing a quiet role in the Digital Compact, for example. We hosted an early discussion in 2020 for the Digital Compact, and we're hosting multiple groups over the past couple of years in these topics, in order to reach to that point. We also think, as Bruno mentioned earlier, about the community. So we worked with ICISCO and the Islamic Charter for AI, which focuses in a big part on protecting culture and religions in terms of AI and the data that's been generated and how is it used within the community. So a lot of work that's happening today from multiple agencies, and I think governments, especially in Saudi Arabia, who had one of the leading organizations like Saudi Data and AI Authority, focuses on building this community and building these projects and working with the international society in order to define and make use of these policies on the global level and on the national level.
Thank you so much. And Alison, if I can come to you, you have led work in the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence on Data Justice, and I know you're also heavily involved in these debates in the G20. As Peter said, we need to start talking about a common language. How do you think the concept of data justice helps us here? And how does it help to move us towards the kind of outcomes that we want to see?
Thanks very much, Claire. So I think there's sort of three main points that data justice work, particularly the work we did in the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, but also that imbued the African Union data policy framework, in fact, and has affected the continental policy. And it's really at looking at issues of the very uneven distribution of the impact of harms, and also, very importantly, I think is the important contribution that came out of this, because there had already been data justice work that was concerned with the realization of human rights in data protection mainly, but data governance work. And so you got that work that was done on data stewardship, alternative data stewardship, data trusts, and those kinds of things. Because obviously, the global application, the Brussels effect of the GDPR, had little impact on communities that were notions of informed consent, have little impact on communities that are not literate, not able to, we can barely sign off on those things. So those kinds of things. So it extended those notion of human rights, but I think very importantly, so that they could be realized by people who were exercising them. But I think importantly, it also raised the issue of the very uneven distribution of opportunities that are associated with these advanced data-driven technologies and the increasing, asymmetry in power relations, in profits, and things that are going in concentration in markets that is going on. And so the data justice approach to data governance for AI specifically looked at the kind of extension of the dominant discourse, which was essentially a responsible and ethical AI. It was a self-governing, a self-regulatory conception that if you could get firms to behave in a certain way, then you would produce these outcomes in a way that doesn't acknowledge these negative multipliers that you've spoken about associated with data. And I think that that important part of that was we see in the regulation that's emerged within the European Union and those sorts of things that are adopting that. I think less attention has been paid in regulation and in policy to ensuring that those rights are enforced in people's daily lives, and that also the enforcement of human rights is not only for the first generation rights, which are, widely expressed and there's kind of normative things on them, but also very importantly on second and third generation rights. And that really is what redresses those inequalities of opportunities and of harms in a global context. So the economic rights and environmental rights. And it really goes again to the point of treating data as a public good. And just probably very finally to say that I think the important thing about the data justice debate is going back to this intractable, wicked, policy problem we have of the digital equality paradox, which underlies the GDC and the realization that, simply layering advanced technologies over existing structural inequalities is simply amplifying those. And I think, that wicked problem we still are having enormous trouble addressing. And just to link it to the previous panel, we are unable to address these until we seriously address these structural inequalities that we know are perpetuating these inequalities, which is, of course, a big human development challenge. People have spoken about the digital divide. People have spoken about the infrastructural challenges that are there. But we know from the limited data we have, and this is actually a critical point linking the different parts of the GDC, is that the GDC does mention the importance of data, the collection of public data, digital statistics, and it does mention the importance of regulating those for the purposes of AI. But people move very quickly on from that. So in terms of financial commitments to addressing these problems, it shifted the focus from digital inequality to the AI need, the need for capacity building and funding, and of course on infrastructure. Whereas we know from the data that the primary problems with digital inclusion, I'm talking about fundamental inclusion, not hypercompute power and various other things, is not infrastructural. It's actually on the demand side. There is 100% coverage in many countries, 99, 95% of coverage in many countries, but we don't have, we have internet access levels of much lower than the 20% that was quoted for where you get those positive effects in growth. So we have to address these basic fundamental data problems, because until we do, those people are never going to appear in these giant data sets that are used to make millions of decisions, automated decisions every day. They're simply not going to be reflected in it. You can't unbias those data sets that are these very powerful information deciding outcomes that operate globally. And just as the last point, because I can see I've run on, is that Abebe Behani's fantastic audits of these demonstrate that without massive digital inclusion, digitization of people's lives across the continent, what you see is the perpetuation of historical injustices, of the exclusion of the vast majority of Africans, the underrepresentation of people at intersections of different kinds of inequality, discrimination in the use of these data sets, etc. So this is really a massive regulatory challenge for us to address.
Thank you. Peter, I'm slightly coming back to your first point about the fact that, we're each of us on the panel has come at this question from a very different perspective in terms of identifying different, equally critical, but different aspects of this challenge, whether we're starting from the community level, whether we're starting from the infrastructure level, whether we're starting from the question of national regulations, whether we're starting from the question of exclusion or sometimes the terms on which inclusion happens in data sets and so on. So clearly the working group has a very big task to do across a very, very broad agenda. As well as being the chair of the working group on data governance, you're also vice chair of the Commission on Science and Technology for Development overall. So given your experience in the Commission, what's your advice to us sitting around the room who are members of that working group, including yourself, of course, around how can we best sort of disentangle this problem that we have been confronted with and turn it, as the theme of our day suggests, into action?
Well, I'm tempted just to say that who am I to give advice? On a more serious tone, we are lucky. The working group is a multi-stakeholder working group. And we know from experience now, as far as I'm concerned, I have been leading 3 working groups, which were all multi-stakeholder working groups. And this one on data governance seems to be one of the best, if not the best. The members of the working group are very knowledgeable, they know their tasks, and they bring different aspects of data governance. And I'm really very happy because I'm learning a lot from the members themselves. And it seems to me that even though half of the working group is made up of representatives from governments, the other half are representing different stakeholders. And in addition to that, the working group is open and inclusive. Open means that observers can be in the room and can take the floor and can contribute. The first meeting that we had was a hybrid meeting where online participants could also take the floor and contribute. And I was a bit surprised having some reactions that it is too inclusive. Meaning that there are so many contributions that people get a bit confused. Who is contributing what? And I am really happy that there is such an interest in this topic. And it shows something that, well, this is an important topic, and I hope that we are up to the expectations. So I would like to emphasize again, it should be a bottom-up working group, it should be a multi-stakeholder working group, and it should bring all the aspects of the data governance on the table, and that is the way to go ahead. So I hope we can come up with some good results. The time is very short. We have to report by the 81st session of the General Assembly. The only thing I can say, I try my best, and I'm sure all the members will try their best.
Thank you so much. Okay, I have one more general question that I would like to ask all of you, and then if we have time, we'll do a quick fire round on action points. One of the benefits of having a global governance framework, if and when we can get to that point, is going to be increased interoperability. That will have a framework that can enable cross-border data flows and the kind of innovation and progress that can come for that. At the moment, as we heard, we have a very diverse regulatory environment at very, very different levels, and this is obviously inevitable and wholly desirable. Context is all. But we need to, as we think about the global framework, think about how can we create an interoperable data governance framework that enables, that doesn't stifle innovation, development, but that also respects some of the principles that we've been hearing today, that we heard so strongly in the working group around data sovereignty, around protecting the rights of communities. How can we square that circle on interoperability? Seems to me one of the key questions that we're going to be grappling with as we go through this process. And I'd love to hear your perspectives on that. So perhaps let's start with you, Bruno.
Yeah, so just a quick footnote. I think it's important to mention, to highlight that interoperability is not the same of copy and paste. So is it possible to have interoperable mechanisms, legal frameworks with some difference, taking into account the context in which the laws will be enforced, which is the point that was made by Alison. The second one, coordination and also harmonization is not like different than having, or is not the opposite than having decentralization enforcement. I think it is also important to take in mind. Why I'm saying this? Because right now, one of the big elephants in the room about data governance is how we are going to connect three pieces of regulation. Antitrust, competition is a big issue. We are not going to have sovereignty in our countries in the global south without having a barrier of entries that is going to be broken. The second one is the full implementation of data protection laws. They were made 100 years ago. For instance, data portability, which is a new right. Who is going to exercise this right now without having interoperability foundation between mechanisms, which is the point that was made by Alison. We have to have in mind that a collective enforcement, a collective rights should be followed by individual rights, in the sense that data portability is just the starting point by individual doing by itself or themselves, and is not going to be a material right, exercisable right, without having interoperability mechanisms. And last but not least, I think when we are seeing those developments regulatory in different regions, I would say that the Brazilian regulatory proposal is very interesting, because we are creating the so-called Brazilian government's regulation ecosystem. So we are going to have a decentralized approach. So the financial bank is going to be the regulator in AI for the financial sector. The telecom regulation is going to be the AI regulator for telecom sector. And then a new entity will have the role to coordinate it. Because the ethics of data governance, the regulation, the hard regulation, it's well already established, but we have to have a new grammar, a new tools to enforce this in those sectors that are going to be affected by a transversal technology such as AI and data.
Thank you. Alison.
Thank you. I think this is a really critical part of the Global Digital Compact, and I fear that there's been some conflation between interoperability from a technical and standards point of view, which we absolutely need, but also has implications, and the kind of harmonized global governance frameworks that we need, kind of rights-based frameworks and things that we need. And I think both are very important, and I think it sort of goes to the point that was made earlier in the earlier panel about distinguishing policy and standards. They go together. And I think it's going to be absolutely critical for us not only to be able to benefit from a digital and AI general purpose economy, to have that kind of interoperability. I think it's important that it's, I think it's really an important opportunity at the regional level. So, for example, in Africa, in the African Data Policy Framework, we already have a harmonized framework, commitments to common data standards that would allow for interoperability, to allow for the Continental Free Trade Area and those sorts of things. So that's simply a regional application of something that ideally you would want to be able to happen at the global level. Why it's important that it's managed, that it's controlled locally first or regionally first, because I think they're regional benefits that you can't achieve at the national level, especially with many of our small economies. You can get the economies of scale and scope to be a meaningful market that people have to take more seriously and engage in that, and would allow for that interoperability. But the problem there is also that we are immediately being tied into global standards and norms, for example, around trade, around intellectual property, and these kinds of things that have not benefited us historically. And so you get this fantastic opportunity of a digital single market in Africa, data policy, harmonized data policy framework, interoperability framework for the African Continental Free Trade Area, and then we introduce digital protocols that are taken directly from the WTO and completely undermine all the efforts around preferential access to markets for local people, data access markets, etc., and those kinds of things. So if we simply apply international free flow of data, and interoperability without addressing the existing unequal flows that there currently are, we're simply going to perpetuate the status quo and the asymmetries of power and information that are currently there.
Thank you. Maybe I'll ask Abdul Rahman first and then come back to you at the end, Peter, for the working group perspective.
I think the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia were lucky to predict the work that's going to happen with data and AI. So starting with a strategy in 2019 and the creation of the Saudi Data and AI Authority to be a single entity that, very similar to what Bruno said, oversee and manage regulation and incentives in the programs for data and AI. And putting them together also give an advantage of combining those regulation and making sure those regulation works together. We're also working with, in that strategy, our main goal is adoption. And I heard that today and multiple times in different occasions that if you come to Saudi, you will see the enthusiasm, especially within the kingdom, all over, from youth and older generation, into the adoption of AI. And that's our strategy, to adopt AI, to leapfrog to the future as well. Therefore, also our regulation is taking a different shape. So we're working very hard with standards and approving and working with different standard organizations to have those standards available, which work with the interoperabilities in the future. Regulation is there. Certain regulations are hard regulation, but also this is a moving target. So AI is not done yet, and we're just at the beginning maybe. Therefore, regulation is working into incentives program to compliance rather than just putting a law and asking people to comply to that law. And maybe to Bruno's notes earlier, some of those laws are really old. Even if you have a law today, it will become maybe old or it did not count for certain things later in the future. Therefore, we developed digital badges, for example, to give an incentive on AI products for compliance with AI ethics. And similar other programs with data sharing and data sharing policies that meant to be for AI governance in the near future. And once those mature enough, then it becomes a law or become a general policy. And at the end, we are looking from a national perspective, maybe later on a regional perspective with iCare and publishing this information, and hopefully sharing this advancement or the work that we have done in Saudi with the global community so others can benefit from the same advancement.
Thank you. Okay, Peter. Interoperability, data sovereignty, inequality. Well,
just building on what I've heard, it seems to me that whatever result we come up with, it will be a temporary result. And I know from experience, just referring, for instance, to the radio regulations of the ITU, it's a work in progress. It's being updated in every 4 years. So probably with the advances of technology and legal frameworks and e-economy and all the aspects, we can come up with a kind of reflection of the instant, of that moment we are in. But we have to be careful because it's going to be a very dynamic regulation, and we should already think about how to cope with that. So I believe the working group can provide some kind of framework which may be valid at that certain point, but the working group should continue either in this form or in different forms. We have to discuss that, to work on the updating of this framework. And it will be even bigger task than, for instance, updating the radio regulations. It's, to me, radio regulations, which is a very complex, it's a 4-volume regulations, if you want to know. Compared to whatever we're doing now, it seems to be the radio regulations is relatively simple. So data governance is going to be something enormous.
Thank you. Yes, this is a very different way of thinking about regulation, not as a sort of line, but as a continuous wave or a process. So thank you very much to the panel. Before I thank you, I just want to ask all of you in the audience, as you've been hearing, have you heard anything that makes you feel even a bit confident that this process, that the work that I'm sure many of you in the room are also involved in over time will mean that, say we're all sitting in this room in 5 or 6 years' time, that we will be able to be more confident that the data that we're producing from whatever technology we have in our pockets then will be used to do good in the world? Can I have a show of hands as to whether people feel a little bit more confident now? There you go, you see, you did a great job. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.